All right, boy, a lot of activity here just getting started today. But I made it to my my usual start time of 10:02. So if you're coming in a little bit late, you'll notice that I did pass out an attendance sheet. As usual, this is something you can do. You don't have to get it right, but it's just for your little pop quiz for your own information about how to deal with a monopoly diagram, right? So give that a shot, and you can either hand it to me after class, thank you, for the extras, or you can just plop your sheet in the box at the back of the room. You're still waiting? They're circulating around here somewhere. You can get one at some point. They'll thank you for. Oh, perfect. So I have some extras up here, but there's also extras in the back. Thank you very much. And it doesn't take very long to do it. Once again, if you want to grab one, you can come up here and grab one. That's fine too. You know what? Maybe I'll just do this. So I put a chair here, put the extras up here. Okay. All right, so I guess I will just dive right in here with the stuff that we'll talk about today. The attendance sheet, once again, is up front if you want to grab it, and they're also circulating. So, in terms of Top Hat readings, Chapter 13 should be up for your enjoyment if you want to look at it. It's more or less coincides directly with what we'll talk about today. Once again, the usual stuff about our exam kind of closing in here. So, we're about 2 weeks out today, right? Today's the 24th, 28th, 31st. We have next week of usual lecture stuff. I should have said 31st here. I'll give out on Halloween, I'll give out some practice materials. We will then review said practice materials on the 4th, and then we'll have our exam on the 7th, right? Exactly as before, right? We'll have a take-home component. We'll have not a take-home component, but an online component, which you can do over a couple of days, and we'll have the in-class component here. Same setup, same length, same kind of, obviously the questions will be different, but the same general idea. A one-pager to do in class, and then something a little bit more involved online. Okay. So last time, what did we do last time? We talked a lot about is this thing going here? Yeah. Last time we talked about monopoly and competition and how we can compare the two, right? And so this is kind of what I referred to as the short-run comparison, which we leveraged. We leveraged our marginal cost and supply curve relationship there to sort of think about what happens if we were to flick this switch and move this industry between a competitive industry and a monopolistic one, right? All production organized under one roof, dispersed production with many small firms, right? So the lesson was, or the big idea was, that the surpluses are the orange and blue on the right here in the competitive world, right? Just where demand and supply cross, as we've always sort of thought about them. Well, when we think about a monopoly, we have to introduce this concept of marginal revenue, right? This effect that selling more requires lower prices. So, not just for the unit you're trying to sell, but for all previous units you were selling. So a monopolist, in some sense, tries to keep that quantity restricted so it doesn't have to lower the price too much, right? This is manifest in our diagram by treating the supply curve as a marginal cost curve. We find marginal cost and marginal revenue at this point QM, and then the corresponding price is on the demand curve at PM. Right, so maybe I'm telling you how to do the attendance sheet, which is fine, right? And then we can, so we see that monopoly is a higher price in a lower quantity than competition, right? And we can also see that there's a societal problem here created by the monopolist in that the sum of the surpluses are smaller, right? In fact, we're missing that triangle there, shaded white on this side, but colored in orange and blue on that side. If you're coming in a little bit late and need an attendance sheet, they're probably floating around, or you can come up front and get one from the chair here. So we see that monopoly creates a deadweight loss, right? Some exchanges don't occur, right, that otherwise would have, or that I should say would occur in a competitive environment. And this is because the monopoly does not want to make such exchanges to keep the price of the ones it does engage in higher, right? So that creates a loss to society. That was the basic comparison we effected from last time, and is kind of a nice illustration of how we put together a variety of moving parts here, right? How we use our competitive benchmark and compare it to something else. Alternatively, how we develop this idea that if the market is organized in this fashion, well, it's not great from the perspective of society, or that society does experience some loss. So we even delved into some policy here, right? Notice how the policy question then emerges. How do we recover that, or what can we do to the industry to recover that lost surplus, right? That morphs into the practical question. How do we get the monopoly to behave more competitively? And so we talked about all these different approaches to this, right? We could regulate the price, in which case the monopolist doesn't, have this marginal revenue effect. It looks like a competitive firm, and then it just gets the market price back for any unit it produces and sells. We could encourage competition by breaking apart monopolies, right? That's another way of doing it. But we also saw that in some instances, our policies, right, our laws in particular, actually create monopolies, right? We haven't said much about this or how this works, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the class when we discuss economic growth and the theory of creative destruction, right? We also mentioned how we have some of these newer monopolies out there, these firms like Facebook, that have something like a monopoly. They have monopoly power in some way, but it's not really the classic monopoly story that we've been telling here, where there's some output and a price. It's something a little different. And of course, we're going to talk about retail monopolies, maybe a little bit actually today. I think we will. Yeah, I'm going to touch on this a little bit today. The good news is, with the exception of the very first thing, we can actually talk about these other things, internet monopolies, retail monopolies, once we develop the tools that we're going to talk about today, right? Which is game theory, which are really a set of tools for talking about strategic interactions between rational competitors, right? And so we'll have some insight into how those things behave as we move along. So, for a practical reason, this is not just important because, it's interesting and because we have those specific cases I mentioned. It turns out that a huge amount of economic activity, almost all of it, falls in between these competitive and monopolistic limits, right? So there's pure monopoly, there's pure competition, and then there's all this stuff in between. Well, most of what we do on a day-to-day basis, right, most of the businesses you interact with on a day-to-day basis, probably fall somewhere in between these two. And so, just to give like two categories, or the way economists talk about two of these in-between instances, there's oligopoly, which you can think about as maybe being closer to monopoly, right? We have a few small firms, a few large firms in the industry. I should have said a small number of large firms. And they produce substitute products, but maybe they aren't exactly the same. So they're kind of like competing monopolies, right? Oligopoly means a few in Greek, right? And so it's a few large firms. So I think someone said that or I saw the statistic somewhere, that most of the output we consume on a day-to-day basis comes from an oligopolistic industry, right? Something like 90% of our expenditures. So this would be things like the clothes you buy, maybe are made by a couple of large firms, or you buy them at like a large retailer like Costco or Target or something. There's soda, Pepsi, Coke, right? That sort of thing. Phones, automobiles, right? All of these things are created in what you might think of as an oligopolistic industry. And we'll talk a lot about that today. Monopolistic competition is maybe more towards the competitive side of the spectrum. And when we think about a monopolistically competitive firm, you think about a small firm that has some local monopoly power, but other firms are able to enter the niche of that firm, not perfectly, but they are able to crowd the firm, maybe I'll say it that way, in such a way that they can intrude a little bit on this firm's turf. So a great example would be a coffee shop, or a bunch of coffee shops, say on the Upper East Side. Right? There's a whole bunch of them just around Hunter. You might think about that as a situation where each one is a little bit different, but they're all sort of in the same market in some way, right? Each producing their own, I guess, somewhat distinct brand of coffee. Hopefully we'll get time to talk about that, but we might, that's a really great subject for deploying these diagrams that we've been talking about, and you'll certainly do it in Eco 200. So individual gas stations, things like that, these small businesses, restaurants are all good examples of that market structure. So that one is a little bit different in that you can do the analysis. I'll say this without showing you how it works. You don't really need to have recourse to a new toolkit. That is not the case with oligopoly. Right? For oligopoly, we need to think about, we sort of need to approach the problem from a completely new perspective, right? So you think about your typical oligopoly business. You have a small number of, I say, uber-rational competitors here. That might be overstating it a little bit. But it's the situation where Coke knows who Pepsi is, Pepsi knows who Coke is, right? They have to engage in these fairly sophisticated analyses of markets, what their opponents will do when they adopt some action, what will Coke do if we advertise at this spot in the Super Bowl, what will Pepsi do if Coke decides to sponsor, NASCAR, who knows, right? All of these things. There's all these strategic interaction, these interactive decisions that must be made. Right? And so when we start thinking about this rational behavior in this environment, our tool, not just our tool in economics, but across a lot of disciplines for analyzing these situations is game theory. Right? So what do we do to analyze a situation using game theory? Well, we have to organize our thinking somehow. We can't just say firms are being strategic, right? What we do is we narrow down or restrict or define well, I can say, the strategic situation we're interested in, right? And then what we can do is we can apply a set of recipes or tools or techniques to think about this strategic situation. And we do this kind of as follows by thinking about, playing a formally described game. So you do this sometimes, right? You bust out a board game. There is an attendance sheet if you're coming in late, so you can just take it. If you got the text on the group chat that you have to come to class today, then you're just coming in. Yeah, I know this because my second class tends to have a lot more people in it than my first, so the word travels quickly, which is good. It's fine. But anyway, think about it this way. You bust out a board game that says how many players are in the game, right? How many players the game is for. It tells you, it has a sheet of rules, and then it tells you how you win the game, right? Or how you decide how well you're doing in playing the game, right? That's not all that different than what we're going to do here. Whenever we think of these strategic interactions, right, we're going to start that way. Who's playing this game, right? Or who's involved in this situation? Right? What are the things they can do? And then what do they get out of doing them? Right? And really the interesting thing is, my outcome depends upon your actions and vice versa. That's what makes it a little bit different, is that we think about that explicitly. So, you can think about, chess or Settlers of Catan. Those are pretty complex games, very complex games by economic standards. And somehow when I was putting together this lecture, I stumbled on this little historical note on games. And it's pretty interesting that one of the first really complex strategic games was actually developed by this Prussian general in the 19th century who was trying to figure out how to train commanders in battle. And it's an interesting little story on these games. So I think about these sorts of games a lot because when I go to the Graduate Center, I get off the subway and I walk past the Complete Strategist, which is, 32nd Street, like between 5th and Madison, I think, maybe 33rd. And they have all of these. My son loves this store. They have all the, all the strategic war games and all these things, Warcraft, all of that stuff, the big board games that you might want to play. So Yeah, those are really complex situations, right? And we're going to think about things, we're going to do what economists do, right? An economy is a complex thing, as is a market. We're going to make it as simple as we possibly can, right? We're going to create, I guess you could think about it this way, the simplest possible board game, and then we're going to think about how we can analyze that and decide what, I guess, good, rational, well-informed players will do when confronted with this situation. And then it'll seem stupid, as often is the case with these models, but you'll see that we can sort of move the logic around and the tools around to understand a variety of things. What are we looking for when we're trying to solve the game? Well, we're trying to think about, A, how a rational player might attack the situation. One of our tools here will be kind of a notion of strategy, which says, whatever you're going to do, I'm going to do what's best for me in responding, right? I know that this is how I'm going to act. You know that this is how I'm going to act, and I know that this is how you're going to act, right? We're both going to be playing very strategically, responding as best as possible to our opponent's actions. Well, if we work through that situation and we arrive at this situation of stability, right, where I'm no longer changing what I'm doing and you're no longer changing what you're doing, right, we've reached something like an impasse, well, or a stable point, we'll call that an equilibrium of our game, right, or an outcome. And some of the things that will help us here when we analyze the strategies or the things that I might do, well, we can think about the things that I always want to do. We'll call those dominant strategies, right? Whatever it is you're going to do, I'm doing the exact same thing, right? And we'll think about dominated strategies as well, things that I never want to do, right? And those two kind of go together, and you'll see how it works here. So if you put all this together, this is a little bit informal, but by the way, you can get very formal with game theory. It can be very sophisticated. You put it all together, it defines Nash equilibrium, right? What we'll call a Nash equilibrium. Now, it used to be the case when I would teach these classes, everybody in the classroom knew who John Nash was, right? That's not so much the case anymore, mainly because, well, he was actually the subject of a movie. Has anybody seen it, A Beautiful Mind? Okay, well, no, yeah. We had a couple hands go up, but yeah, A Beautiful Mind, it was about the life of John Nash, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, right, for exactly the stuff we're talking about. He was able to prove that games that we can, just about any game you can describe using players, strategies, and payoffs, actually has a Nash equilibrium, right, an existence proof. Big time stuff. He also did some interesting things on bargaining theory. Tragically, he had some very significant mental health problems as he got older, and that is kind of a sad story about how that went. So, but the movie's very good. Russell Crowe was the star of the movie, so interesting if you get a chance to watch it. I don't know how much it says about game theory, but it's interesting about John Nash. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is invent a little board game for you, and we can call it, if you need a name for it, right, left, up, down, right? So this is, by the way, the simplest interesting game you can make, right? You might even find it's not all that interesting, but I'll contend that any game that's simpler than this really isn't that interesting. So you you buy the game at Complete Strategist, and you open up the box and read the rule books. It says players 2, right? And then the rule book is really short. It says each player has 2 actions, right? One player, we'll call the row player, for reasons that'll become clear in a second, can choose to go up or down. Just the 2 things that you can do here. The other player, the column player, can do 2 things as well. Can choose left or right, right? Once the players, you can think about it this way, write their decisions down on a piece of paper, and then they flip those papers over simultaneously. We put the markers in the right place, and then the game is over, and payoffs are decided, right? And all you're trying to do is get the highest payoff you possibly can, right? Whether or not someone wins if they have a higher payoff, well, we'll just think about it that way, how well you did. So it's like playing Scrabble. You just care about your score being as high as possible. You don't worry so much about whether or not it's greater than the other player's score. So I've actually put over here some payoffs, right, that occur if you think about it this way, now we have a game where 4 possible things can happen, right? So this isn't like Settlers of Catan or even chess, right, where there's uncountably many things that can happen, right, in a game. There's only 4 things, right? And we can sort of think about what happens by just imagining exhausting all the alternatives. The up left outcome, well, here I've said that row payoff is 3 and column payoff is 1, up right 0, 2, so on and so forth. And now we want to know, what is the likely outcome of this game, right? Particularly when we apply the basic ideas that I described before, right? And so you can think about a lot of this as what would happen if we played this game over and over and over again and became intimately familiar with different outcomes and all of that stuff. Or you can just think about it as a case where we have super analyzed the game, right? We've thought about it for hours and hours before we play, right? What might happen in this case, and we're both rational, right? The players. So here I've arranged the game in the way we like to think about these things. This is called the normal form. You might even think about this as the board game form, right? Where if you're the row player, you have a piece, right? Like like Monopoly, like a hat or a dog or a race car or something, and you put it on up or down, right? The 2 entries there below row. And then if you're the column player, you have a piece as well, and you put your marker on left or right. And then we just sort of look for the, kind of go to the right of the down and go down from the right, and whatever box we're in, that's where the payoff is, right? This is called the normal form of a game, right, in this matrix form. And we do this because it's pretty easy to see visually what happens, right? So for example, the way you would read this, when row player chooses up, right? Maybe now you can see why I called the game row and column, because that's how our board game is arranged here. When row player chooses up, well, that puts us in the first row, the top row, and column player chooses left, that puts us in the upper left part of the box there, right? Now the 3 and the 1, well, the 3 is the payoff that the row player gets in this state of the world, and the 1 is the payoff that the column player gets in this state of the world, right? So essentially I've just taken this information and arranged it in this way, right? So another example, when row plays down and column plays left, row gets 2, column gets 1, right? And that's how it works. Now that's how we can view this. That's the playing surface here for my game. Not quite as neat as the Prussian military game, right, where the original playing surface was made out of sand and was like this giant terrain map. But you can sort of see, right, the idea, of course, is to be as simple and transparent as possible in describing this. So how do we go about solving these games? Well, we might just do what a very rational player would do, is just sort of engage in a lot of if-then behavior and figure out what the best possible thing to do is. So I think I can go like this. Hopefully if you noticed me before class, I was trying to actually copy things over beforehand. I think that's my game, right? That top 3102, 3102, 2112, okay? So we can kind of think about it. The way you might want to do this is just sort of guess a box and think about what happens or what your opponent would do. So let's see. Suppose row player just chooses down here, right? Now, well, let's actually switch this a little bit. Let's suppose that column player were to choose left, right? So that kind of starts us in this box here, right? Now, what is then the best response to that for the row player? Well, the row player now says, well, let's see, if we're in this, if we happen to be in this column, right? Well, let's see, my best response is to choose down, I get 2, up, I get 3. I should choose 3, right? Fair enough? So we could say that best response to column choosing left is row player choosing up, right? So we can kind of say, all right, well, if this is the choice, then I'm choosing this. Well, now we can sort of think about this from another perspective. We can say, all right, well, let's see. If row player were to choose up, what is the best response of column player? Well, column now faces a choice between 1 and 2, right? So column's best response is then to choose R, right? Well, now we can return back to the row player and say, okay, well, let's see. If column were to choose right, my best response is to choose down, right? Like this. Okay? And now column player could say, all right, well, if row player is choosing down, right, my best response is then, well, I'm comparing 1 and 2, my best response is to choose right. So now we find column player chooses right, row player responds with down, row player chooses down, column player responds to right. So this is best responses to best responses, and we would say that this is the Nash equilibrium of the game, right? You can even reverse that and say, at all of these other points, if one player knew what the other player was doing, they would prefer to switch their action, right? So that's one way of thinking about how you might find the Nash equilibrium. It turns out there's a simpler way, which I'll talk about in a second. But just some highlights here that you might point out or that you might think about here is, well, you can see here that there are some situations that, where the payoffs are the same here. So in some sense, at this Nash equilibrium, the column player doesn't really care about up or down, right? The payoff's the same. It's 2 in either case. The row player, however, prefers down, so that's what pushes us here. So you have some of these circumstances where there's ties, but one of the players' preferred response can break that, right? So you can have these positions where the payoffs are the same, and even still arrive at a Nash equilibrium. And we'll get some practice with this, illustrating how you do this. My experience is that you just have to do some of this on your own if you're, in this class, and the problem set has some practice problems with that. A lot of times the problem is sort of the problem that students face is keeping, which payoffs you're comparing as you do this straight. So one other thing that might help you do this is you can, in retrospect, we can look at this, you can look at these payoffs and you can say, well, wait a minute here. This Baker's game is even more ridiculous than you might think here, because column player gets 2 whenever they choose right, and they get 1 basically whenever they choose left. We can rule out ever playing left in this game. So now it's become even less interesting as a board game, right? Well, if you're a column player, you always play right, right? And now, of course, you can say, well, if column player is always going to play right, row player's best response is down, so we find out that this is the Nash equilibrium. One thing you might say is L is a dominated strategy for the column player, or you might say row is a dominant strategy, right, for the column player. Okay, so we can look at another example here, and let's give this a try here. It turns out that this game, by the way, let me just make a note here, note to self that this is the outcome. This is my note to self that I made earlier when I was putting this up here. So maybe I'll just do this so we know that this is the payoff outcome. Well, let's think about this game. Let's start here. Let's suppose that for whatever reason, we're not saying the game is going to end this way, but we're just saying let's start our logic here. Let's suppose that row player starts out by choosing U and column player starts out by choosing right. So now, maybe I've added a feature to my game where you randomly fill in the boxes. That would be, would you buy that game? $25 a complete, probably not, right? Randomly filling in the, I could have like a 4-sided die or something for filling in the payoffs. Anyway, suppose we've done that, and so we've changed the payoffs a little bit. And we'll just start off and say, well, maybe we know this isn't a Nash equilibrium because it's 0-0, nobody gets anything. But we're going to start there and see what best responses are and see where that takes us. So right off the bat, if row player is confronted with column player choosing right, well, the best response is down, right? Well, because 2 is greater than 0. Well, now we can see that if the column player chooses, or if the column player is confronted with the row player choosing down, well, the column player faces a choice between 1 and 2, right? 2 is better than 1, so the best response to down is for column to choose left, right? So that kind of moves us here and then here. Well, now what does row player do? Row player says, well, if column player is choosing left, I'm comparing 1 and 3. I'm going to choose down. So my best response to left is down. Column player's best response to down is left. We've found a point of stability here again, right? Fair enough. So, one other thing we might observe from this is that I could have solved this game by finding dominant strategies, right? It's often the quick shortcut to doing this. So for example, for the row player, 3 is always greater than 1, 2 is greater than 0. So whatever the column player does, I always do better playing down. So in this state of the world, I should just choose down, right? And then that's another way of thinking about how we get to this Nash equilibrium, right? Nash equilibrium there. So one thing we might do, here's my note to self is just good. Well, what do I mean by that? Oh, I'm sorry by saying good here on my game here. Well, you might ask a couple of questions about this. Is the outcome good from the perspective of the players? Or if you're an economist, as we become better economists, we might sort of think about this question from the perspective of society. Where here our society is pretty simple, right? It's just 2 people who are playing this game. Is the outcome as good as it possibly could be, right? So if we were playing Scrabble, we might say, well, was this Scrabble game we look at the board afterwards and we say, wow, that's what my son and I play a lot, and that's kind of what we do. Oh, look at those words we got there, a couple 6 letters. So pursuant to that idea, we might say, well, it's the sum of the scores, right? The sum of the utilities that sort of judge how well society is doing in this case. And we can kind of think about it that way, right? So we can look at up and down and left and right. Well, we see all these boxes. We see that our game ultimately ends up here. And so we can say societal welfare or societal well-being is just the sum of those payoffs. We can say it's 3 at this point, right? And that might be interesting because we might say, well, that's not the point we would have agreed upon if we could have agreed upon, reaching the best alternative for all of us, right? So in this particular case, we could have gotten a sum of 4 here, right? But we instead settled on this situation, or we arrived at, I should say, the situation of 3. That's interesting. Right? We don't necessarily create the best possible outcome for the 2 of us. You might think about, at least in sum total, you might think about why that happens. Well, it's a result of strategic behavior, right? Getting in the way. For example, you might say, hey, let's commit to play this one. I'll play L and you play U, right? And that'll give us the best possible game from our perspective. Shake on it, we agree, and then when we actually play the game, you switch your thing to R, and I say, why'd you do that? I went from 3 to 0, and you say, well, I don't really care about you so much. I'm going from 0 to 2, right? Or 1 to 2. I'm doubling my payoffs. And so that incentive that you face keeps us from settling at this point. Okay. Well, of course, here something different happens, where we arrive at the best possible outcome for society, right? We arrive at 3-2. If you're coming in a little bit late, don't forget to do your attendance sheet, drop it in the boxes, give it to me after class. In that case, we arrive at this situation, which is fine, right? So it's not always the case that strategic behavior, I guess, results in something that, isn't as good as it could be from the perspective of society, our game players here. Well, let's push this a little bit further and think about this game. This game, it turns out, is extremely important from our perspective as economists, and we can think about it this way. And indeed, I'm going to kind of, give you a little food for thought as we solve this game. Actually, you know what? Take a second and think about where you think this game might land. Think about it on your own here. Okay, well, let's just start it out here as I've been doing before, and I'll say, all right, well, let's see. let's start in this box and see what happens. You play left, I play up, right? I'm the row player, you're the column player, I guess. Well, if I know you're going to play left, my best response is to play down, right? 4 is greater than 3. Yes? So that would tend to push us in this direction. Well, if you knew I was going to play down, your best response is to play right. Yeah? Because 1 is less than 2. So that kind of pushes us in this direction. Well, if I knew you were going to play right, and if I knew you were going to play right, well, my best response is also to play down, right? Because 2 is greater than 1. So you can kind of see what happens here. If you knew I was playing down, you would play right. If I knew you were playing right, I would play down. We wind up with our Nash equilibrium here, right? Down here. So this, of course, is interesting, given everything I've said about, thinking about how good the game is, right? By thinking about the sum of our payoffs, you can see here that this is our Nash equilibrium, yet this is a situation where we both are better off, right? This is a situation in which we both are better off. So our strategic behavior in this case winds up sort of creating a worse outcome for everyone, right? And this is going to be an important thing. I'm not going to spill the beans completely on all the ways we can think about this, but suffice it to say, this structure will be an important one going forward. You know what? Maybe I'll go back to my slides here. Hopefully they more or less coincide with what I'm doing. Maybe we'll actually, at this point, we'll go back to our oligopoly setting, right? We got swept up for a minute there in thinking about game theory and strategic interactions. Well, let's try to apply it to a situation. And this is one of the classic situations to which we apply game theory. We imagine that row and column now are businesses, right? Duopolists, say. So we only have 2 businesses in the industry, right? And they have choices to make. Instead of having row and column and up and down, we'll suppose that these businesses can choose whether to produce a low amount of output or a high amount of output, right? Low or high. Low or high, right? Okay, well, what is the big idea here? Well, you might think about this as asking this question, do firms want to produce, will these 2 firms, these duopolists, want to behave more jointly like a monopoly, or will they want to behave jointly more competitively? Right? When they produce low output, they're restricting output like a monopolist, my first diagram of the day, right? And that will keep prices higher for everyone, both firms in the industry, so maybe that's good, right? When they both produce high output, well, they're behaving more competitively, right? And that might produce lower prices and lower profits for everyone. So maybe we're trying to get some insight into how that works. Now I have this example from the so-called lysine market, right, for both simplicity and drama, right? What is so dramatic about the lysine market? Well, it's very exciting that it's an additive used in animal feeds. Well, one thing that's nice about the lysine market is it does actually have basically 2 firms in it. Ajinomoto and Archer Daniels, right? Archer Daniels Midland, I'm sorry. It also made an appearance in Jurassic Park, right? Though, once again, we're now back into the 90s. A Beautiful Mind, Jurassic Park. I don't know how many people have seen these movies. Jurassic Park, I'm guessing most of you have seen, some configuration of the Jurassic Park movies. My kids have no interest in Jurassic Park. So, anyways, there is a scene in which lysine is discussed. So it turns out that on the island of Jurassic Park, what they do is they I guess, leave something out of the genetic makeup of the dinosaurs, so that they can, so they cannot produce lysine, which is this protein that they need to have. And so this is in case something goes terribly wrong on Jurassic Park, you can restrict lysine, and the dinosaurs won't be able to survive without it, right? So that's what lysine does in the movie there. And I put a clip of the film in there, but I'll let you watch that on your own time. Samuel Jackson is there in said scene. So. Once again, I know this all sounds pretty ridiculous, but think about it this way. This is a very simple example, both in terms of the game and in terms of my exact scenario here, that captures a general idea. Right? That captures something about the incentives faced by these duopolists. So here's a very fancy, dressed-up version of the game that we just talked about. Why is it like the game we just talked about? Well, you can see it has this characteristic. When both firms, ADM and Ajinomoto, produce 30 million pounds, i.e. a low output, well, they'll both make 180 million in profit. Right? By the same token, when ADM and Ajinomoto both produce a lot of lysine, well, they make less profit. They make 20 million less each than they would make up there. Of course, the best case scenario for you, if you happen to be ADM, is that your competitor produces a small amount of output and you produce a large amount. Right? Why is that a good setting? Well, in that sense, what they've done keeps the price high, and then what you do reaps the benefits of them keeping the price high for you. Right? So that's the best case scenario here for each firm. Your counterpart producing a low amount while you produce a high amount, and that gives us 2150. So if you want to compare the payoffs here to the scenario I just described, well, I know it's hard to see here, the 3-3-2-2 situation, it's basically just that scaled up. Right? It's exactly like that last game we analyzed scaled up. So you might surmise that accordingly the equilibrium, the Nash equilibrium, is down here. Well, one thing I didn't say in analyzing the game before, the simpler numbers, is that there is in fact a dominant strategy for both firms, and the dominant strategy is to produce a lot. Right? So as an example, ADM makes 200 million, which is greater than 180, or 160 million, which is greater than 150, whenever it produces a high amount, right? In that case, it sort of doesn't leave itself open to being undercut, right? And at the same time automatically undercuts the other firm, should the other firm produce low. And so producing a high amount, 20 greater than 180, 160 greater than 150, is a dominant strategy, right? Put another way, producing a low amount is a dominated strategy in this setting. And you can see that's for both firms, which again points us to this situation down here, right? So once again, if we wanted to think about societal welfare here, well, we should get a little bit more expansive. We can say that our Nash equilibrium concept says that the firms will wind up competing, right? They'll behave more competitively than monopolistically. From the perspective of society, right, at least if we think about society as we did before, just consisting of these two firms, that's too bad, right? They're upset about this. They would like to be able to produce a small amount, right? But from our perspective, if we expand the analysis to think about consumers, this is kind of a good thing, right? We're saying that an oligopoly, right, can actually just in this way, the oligopolists face this incentive to behave competitively because of their strategic interactions. So that's kind of good news that our industry works like this. So there's one other caveat to this, is you can also look at this diagram and you can see why the firms might be interested in colluding, right? That is to say, figuring out how they can stop producing 40 million pounds and together jointly produce 30 million pounds. Right? They might enter into a collusive agreement, and indeed, in your typical industrial organization class, that's a big subject. Right? Can firms collude? How do they want to collude? All these things. And in fact, Ajinomoto and Archer's Daniel Midland were sued for trying to collude, right? For entering a cartel-like agreement and to restrict the lysine market. And they lost that lawsuit and had to pay some damages and agree never to do it again, stuff like that. So once again, my little game of up, down, left, right, it turns out that it has some kind of interesting insights, right, as simple as it is, into how firms might strategically interact. Well, it gets better than that. This particular game is actually a particular case of the so-called prisoner's dilemma game, which some of you may have seen in some class that you've taken, right? It might have been a political science class. It might have been a biology class, believe it or not. This game, so I'm doing you sort of a favor here in describing this game for you in detail. It pops up in all branches of the social sciences and beyond, right? Because of this situation that it models so nice and neatly. This situation where our competitive behavior winds up undermining something that is good from the perspective of the competitors. Why is it called the prisoner's dilemma? Well, the classic backstory is something like this, and it really, I guess, accentuates, when you tell the story in this way, it really accentuates the idea that there is something like backstabbing going on, and that's kind of how competitive behavior enters the model. So here we have yet another example from cinema from bygone years, right? This is Thelma and Louise. Has anybody seen Thelma and Louise? So, okay, we got a couple people who've seen it, right? Let's see. There was, I think it might have been close to the first movie Brad Pitt was ever in. Susan Sarandon, Gina Davis, right? Kind of a fun movie. Anyways, so in this, unlike in the actual movie, I won't spoil the plot for you. We'll suppose that Thelma and Louise, go on some sort of criminal rampage, but then they're caught, and there's some question as to their guilt. Their guilt would be easy to verify if someone would confess, and so the police do the usual thing. They separate the two of them, put them in their separate interview rooms, and say, all right, well, if you confess, we'll lay it out for you. This is what you can expect. And so you can think about, the top left strategy, or the top left box, results when both players, Thelma and Louise, wind up confessing. Well, in this circumstance, right, nobody's confession is really, they both wind up not confessing, right? Well, in this circumstance, it's hard to convict them of anything that serious, so they both get relatively light sentences, right? 5 years apiece. Well, if Louise was to confess, was to not confess, and Thelma was to confess, well, that would hang the crime mainly on Louise, right? And then Thelma gets off with a pretty light sentence, and Louise basically takes the heat, right? Vice versa, if Thelma were to not confess and Louise were to confess, well, that would put us in the upper right there, right? The mirror image of this situation. Now, when both confess, nobody's confession is essential to the conviction, so they both wind up with pretty strict sentences, right? Maybe they get a little bit off for cooperating, but they both wind up with pretty strict sentences. So you can see here the numbers are, now we want to the players want the smallest possible numbers, right? But the incentives are exactly the same as they were in the Ajinomoto ADM example, as they were in my generic example for my game before. And we would expect that the Nash equilibrium, well, we don't have to expect it, we can show that the Nash equilibrium is down here, where both players confess, right? And this game, this kind of gives it an air to the flavor of what's going on, right? Like you're sort of saying, well, what's happening is, one player is being suckered into being nice to the other player, and the other player is then undermining that player, right? And the fact that everybody knows that those are the operating incentives, well, in the end, they wind up with everybody undermining everybody. Now, from the perspective of the participants, this isn't good, right? And from the perspective of society, however, in both this example and my oligopoly example, you might think of the outcome as being good, right, from the perspective of society. Because they behave competitively, but that interpretation won't always be the case. We will see that we can use this in studying some environmental economics issues, in which case it'll be a true societal dilemma. Well, of course, maybe I've sort of revealed to you this thing that the payoff numbers aren't important. It's just their relative relationship to one another that we care about, right? Or that gives us this effect. So, if just a little catalog of all the situations in which this pops up, we'll talk about the one up there more going forward. But you can use this to model a variety of strategic interactions. So here we have countries as our competitors who have to decide whether or not to reduce emissions. And so the upper left box is where both countries engage in emissions reduction behavior, have cleaner environment, but incur some of the costs of doing so. Of course, the lower left box here is where country B doesn't produce emissions, but country A does. Now, country B gets the benefits of cleaner environment, right, without bearing any of the costs, whereas country A doesn't get the cleanest environment and bears the cost, right, of whatever agreement is entered into. So in the end, you can think about this as maybe resulting in this international agreement about emissions reduction as winding up with nobody reducing emissions, right? That's an example of a free riding problem we're going to talk about later in the class. Here we have disarmament, the same idea, right? You might want to agree to disarm. Here we have the USSR and the USA. So yet another blast from the past here, from the 80s. Yes?
This is going to be on the exam, right? Like an example of that?
I guess so, yeah. I think I should put it on there. I've talked about it almost the whole lecture here, yeah. So I don't know if these particular examples will be on there, but I'll think of something. Sure. And you'll see from practice materials, right, if it in fact is on there. But anyway, disarm, you can hopefully work through the logic here. It's great if we have no weapons, right, across the two countries, but what's even better for your particular country is if you're armed and your opponent is not, right? That would reflect the 4-1 vis-a-vis the 3-3. And so the USSR and the US, this was indeed a classic example of strategic interaction. And its application was game theory and international politics. Yet another great movie about this subject, Dr. Strangelove. A lot of game theory in that one. Has anybody seen Dr. Strangelove? Nice, right? So that's what, an old Stanley Kubrick movie. It has to do with one country builds a doomsday device, which it basically will be set off if it's ever attacked, and it's set up so that that country has no control over it going forward, right? So they're committed to destroying everything if they're ever attacked. The problem is you have to tell someone, right, that you've put this device in place for it to have its effect. So I'll let you watch the movie. It's a fantastic movie. So here's a biological game where you can think about two animals interacting, like maybe they're contesting for a mate or something, and they can adopt either a peaceful or a warlike stance, hawk-dove stance, right? So we have, when both animals wind up being aggressive, right, or belligerent, that's not good. They both wind up hurting each other. That's the hawk-hawk scenario. It would be better if they were peaceful, but our logic suggests that maybe they can't do this, right? So we've got the very destructive behavior as our equilibrium result. There's a lot more to this particular game than that, and it brings in a branch of game theory, evolutionary game theory, which is fascinating as well, right? In that particular style of game, you assume that the contestants are hardwired to play in certain ways, right? Right. So players they adopt particular strategies just because that's their genetics, right? And then you see how the population evolves over time. So there are several other classic examples of games out there, and when you have a small game like up down right left or left right like mine, you can only fill in the payoffs in so many ways, and this about exhausts the universe here. But these games, can illustrate some facts about games in general, and they can also illustrate various ideas for us. So the classics. We have Prisoner's Dilemma, we have the Stag Hunt, we have we used to call this matching pennies, but I call it penalty kicks. That's a better one. And then we have the Knicks Nets game here, right? What are each of these games showing? Well, the Stag Hare game is puzzling because or what we use it to analyze a situation where there's some cooperative enterprise which requires everybody to participate in for it to work. So stag hunting, it's big game, right? If we all in our tribe get together and hunt stag, we can all earn a really high payoff. But everybody has this alternative that's safe but low payoff, right? So you can see hunting hare, say, if we have our two players there, will always guarantee me a payoff of 1. Hunting stag, I only get 3 if you also participate. You can show that this game actually has 2 equilibria. So maybe you've been wondering whether all games have exactly 1 resting point. The answer is no. Both hunting hare, both hunting stag. And I'll let you convince yourself that that's correct. Well, down here is an even a starker example, which we often use to think about coordination, right? And so the setting might be as follows, where you and your friend get together and you have a big conversation. You say, all right, hey, let's go see the basketball game tonight. Yeah, let's do it. All right, let's go see the game, right? We're going to go see the basketball game. Then you go into the subway, and in your excitement, you forgot to mention which team you were going to see. Were you going to go to the Barclays Center and see the Nets, or were you going to go to Madison Square Garden and see the Knicks? Well, you're a Knicks fan, and your friend is you're a Nets fan, and your friend is a Knicks fan, right? And so you want to go to a game, but you also want to be with your friend, and you would prefer to be at the game for your team. So this kind of reflects that idea, right? That if I go to the Nets and you go to the Nets, I get 2 and you get 1. If you go to the Knicks and I go to the Knicks, well, we're both at the same game. I'm excited, but I like the Nets better. I get 1 and you get 2, right? So once again, we have 2 equilibria. What do we do in these circumstances? One answer is you can randomize, right? Flip a coin and decide where to go. But we often use these games to think about the value of coordination and not only coordination but also communication. So, if you and your friend could communicate, maybe you would say, well, let's go to the Knicks this time because we went to the Nets last time, something like that. And that would guarantee you a payoff. Randomization doesn't, right? And down here, there's no resting point for the game. Why is it called penalty kicks? Well, let's think of a very simple penalty kick game where there's a keeper and there's a shooter, and we can think about which direction the shooter shoots in and which direction the keeper jumps in. If the ball goes in the goal, of course, the shooter's happy. If the ball does not go in the goal, right, the goalie's happy. So you can think about maybe the shooter, maybe the best way to do this is the shooter is choosing the columns and the keeper is choosing the rows, right? So when the shooter goes left and the goalie jumps left, the goalie gets a payoff of 1, right? The shooter gets a payoff of -1. Now, if you think about, what the best response is, let's see. If the shooter knew the goalie was going to jump left, the shooter would shoot right, and that would reverse the payoffs, right? -1 for the keeper, 1 for the shooter. Well, the keeper sort of looks at this and says, if I knew the shooter's going to go right, I would go right, and that would reverse the payoffs again. Well, keep it rolling, and we just go round and round and round, and it never rests. So the only solution to this game is randomization. And people have actually written papers on this, right, to sort of study the patterns and the randomization. There's actually a paper on penalty kicks. Okay, so Nash, he mentioned he proves that all such games, even games much more complex than this, always have at least one equilibrium, right? Nash proved that. But you have to allow for randomization. So you could say me jumping left and me jumping right half of the time is my strategy. You shooting left and you shooting right half of the time is your strategy. That can be an equilibrium. But he proved that all games have an equilibrium. Pretty interesting stuff. Okay. So the Nash equilibrium concept, it turns out, we don't just have to restrict it to these simple matrices. Even more complicated matrices where we have 3 or more players, 2 or more actions, whatever, that can get pretty complex pretty quickly. We can use this logic generically, and one of these examples here will actually help us understand going forward the famous chain store. The famous discount big box retailer problem that I've been talking about, right? Big retail, and we'll be able to think about what that looks like. And also that Microsoft suit I mentioned last time. So the names that I have up here are Bertrand and Hotelling. And Bertrand was an economist writing in the 1870s, maybe earlier, 1860s I should look, who developed a theory of oligopoly that was a little bit different, or duopoly I should say, that was a little bit different than the standard one. It just involved setting price when firms produce the same product. Hotelling, we'll start with Hotelling here, developed a model of locational choice, right? A highly stylized model of location choice, but one that's quite interesting. And so you can think about it this way. think about it this way. So imagine that we have a beach, right, that has a certain fixed length like this, a beach, okay? And we have some vendors who are selling hot dogs on this beach, right? And maybe we have exactly 2 vendors, right? I'll have the red and the black here denoting my 2 vendors. And all they have to do, they sell the same hot dogs. They can sell as many as they want at a going price to whatever consumers they get. They don't have to determine price or anything. They just have to decide where to locate on this beach, right? We'll imagine that customers are uniformly located on this beach. What beach it is, I don't know, Orchard Beach maybe? The Bronx Riviera. We'll have they're located all along the beach here. The only catch is that every customer, right, because the hot dogs that each vendor is selling are identical, they just go always to the closest vendor, right? And so now we ask, what is a Nash equilibrium in locational choice? Well, I don't know, it's maybe not obvious how to answer this problem, but let's just start out by guessing some locations. Let's suppose our competitor 1 here, call this 1 and 2, easier to say. Competitor 1 decides to locate there, and competitor 2 decides to locate there, right? Say, okay, they just randomly decided that, but as economists, thinking about strategy, we can now say, well, what is the best response like here, right? If, for example, I'm player 1 and I see that you've located here as player 2, what is my best response then? Knowing that, well, let's see, these customers are going to come to me, those customers are going to go to you. Somewhere in between there's a dividing line, right? And that will determine our market demand. If I'm trying to get the largest market demand, where should I locate? Well, let's see. If you set up shop here, you're 2 and I'm 1, where should I set up? What's my best response? I'll redraw it here. Maybe you've gotten there earlier and decided to stake out that location. Well, you should be able to convince yourself that my best response is to locate here, right? Why is that the case? Well, now I've captured all of this market demand. I've left this market demand to you, but I just care about my market demand, my sales. I've made my sales as large as possible. So there's my best response to your action. Now, as we're going to employ this concept of Nash equilibrium, what is your best response to my action then? Well, it's certainly not to stay sitting there, right? Your best response is to just wheel your cart around so you're right here, right? Yeah? Are we done? No, right? My best response then is to wheel my cart around and park it here, right? You can see that still gives me, as long as we're left of or right of center here, that still gives me the maximal demand. You can see that we're going to continue this process where we leapfrog each other with our carts until it's the case that we're both more or less right in the middle here, right? So we wind up landing in the middle here. So this result is actually, you might think of as kind of maybe even comical, but it actually says quite a bit about economic activity where these locations are important, right? Where location is of overriding importance. So maybe we're thinking about a situation where you're driving along the highway for 100 miles, there's no gas stations, and then there's an exit where there's 5 of them, right? 5 fast food restaurants all piled up. Well, maybe you can sort of see what's happening if you think about it this way, right? I mentioned left and right. People also use this model to think about politics, right? Where you quite literally interpret left as left and right as right, and think about where a candidate wants to position themselves on some issue. And it says maybe in the general election you want to drift to the center if people go to their closest candidate, right? It's another illustration of the idea. So this hoteling model is a very nice way of thinking about strategic location choice. Okay, I had more in my lecture notes, but we'll have to leave it for last time. But this is really cool. So if you get up and leave now, I will throw away your attendance sheet. Let's think about this Bertrand model, which was a model of oligopoly. And we're going to deploy a couple pieces here. One of which is we're going to think about our constant marginal cost situation, right? where both firms can produce whatever output they want at a given unit cost. So $2, whatever, right? It's fixed, whether it's your first unit, your 1,000th unit, all of that, right? Constant marginal cost, here's quantity, here's price. There's a demand curve for the product. And there's two firms producing this product. Exactly the same product. All the firms have to do is decide what their price is going to be, right? So firm 1 chooses a price. That's fine. Firm 2 chooses a price. What do consumers do? Well, the product's identical. It's exactly the same. The unit costs are the same for the firms. Consumers buy the product from whoever's charging the lower price, right? That's what's going to happen. So let's think about it this way. Let's suppose that you lay out a price like this, P1, right? And I come into the market and I see you're charging P1. What is my best response? Well, I know that if I can charge a price less than yours, I get all the customers. So I'll charge a price. It's just a little bit less than yours, right? Dirty trick. I get all the customers, you get 0 customers, I make all the money. But you're not done yet. You say, well, if Baker's going to do that, my best response is to do the exact same thing. Right? To undercut Baker a little bit. Yeah? Well, best response once again. So on and so forth. Where does it end? Well, it ends with both of us charging a price equal to cost, right? Both of us charging P1 equal P2 equals C. We split the customers maybe randomly, and that's where the market ends up. Now, of course, this is interesting if you think about it from the perspective of society, and it says that these two firms wind up behaving more or less like a competitive firm, right? Remember when we introduced this graph last class with the constant marginal costs. Great, right? So in this sense, it says even two firms, if they're producing something that's really similar, might wind up behaving quite competitively in their pricing. Last little twist, though. What happens if, let's see, here's firm 1, here's firm 2, exact same model, but now the costs differ for the firms. In particular, firm 2 has a higher unit cost from producing than firm 1. What would the Nash equilibrium be in this situation? So here we have Q, here we have demand, here we have P. I should have labeled my graph a little bit better before. Well, let me just throw it up there since the time is getting late, and we'll see how, and hopefully you can think about this. The Nash equilibrium of this game is where firm 1 charges a price just below the costs of firm 2, right? That's a dirty trick, isn't it? They capture the whole market, firm 2 produces nothing and makes no product. And meanwhile, using your knowledge of geometry, you can probably say firm 1 gets this price and earns this profit. Right? So firm 1 monopolizes the industry and earns profit. We call this a model of limit pricing, right? And I will argue later in class that this is something like what a lot of these big retailers do, right? And something like what an entrepreneur might do in certain circumstances. Create a monopoly and engage in this sort of limit pricing. So in fact, this model popped up, maybe slightly more fleshed out with math and other fancy things. This model popped up in the Microsoft suit, right? So the government says, how could you possibly argue, Microsoft, that you're not a monopolist? You produce 90% of the operating systems out there. Well, Microsoft said, well, that may be true, but there's an enormous amount of implied competition out there. Let me draw a graph for you, Judge. This is us. This is our cost of producing operating systems. That's cost of Microsoft. This is everybody else in the industry, right? Somebody out there could create an operating system for just a little bit more than what we're providing them at. As a consequence, we are not engaging in the usual marginal revenue, marginal cost stuff. We just charge a price slightly above our costs, but slightly below the costs of everybody else. It's a genius argument, right? We look like a monopoly, but we're pricing competitively, right? Because that's all we can do, right? And that was, this limit pricing argument was a nice piece of that suit. And we'll use it again, right? Later in the semester, we'll revisit this when we talk about monopoly and economic growth and all that stuff. So thanks for bearing with me. I didn't get through all of my slides, so what we'll do is next class we'll talk about two other things: behavioral game theory and sequential games, both of which are loads of fun. And in retrospect, maybe what we've done is enough. So I will see you then.